Good evening and welcome to Tiski Sour. I am a newly jabbed Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani, who for the first time in I think quite a while is in the Novara Media studio. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Michael. I'm recovering from an asthma attack earlier on because we've not been keeping the place spick and span. But that's going to change now, Michael, because you've been jabbed, I've been jabbed. The whole Novara family is being jabbed, and there's now a semblance of normality. It's great to be back here, Michael, and it's great to be talking to you this evening.
Is it pretty dusty there? I've still got to wait a couple of weeks for mine to kick in, but I am very excited to have Moderna flowing through my veins. Tonight's show is a big one. There was some breaking news just before we went live, so we've rejigged things a little bit. We now know. We think that the full reopening on the 21st of June is now going to be delayed for 4 weeks. We'll be talking about the reasoning behind that and the significance of it. We're also going to talk about the other big story of the day, which is the G7 and a commitment they have made about vaccines. Is it enough? It's not enough. You could have guessed that already. We're also going to talk about the Unite elections, very, very important for the left, and Keir Starmer making his mind up about players taking the knee to protest racism. Better late than never, but always late because it's Keir Starmer we're talking about. As ever, if you haven't already, please do hit subscribe. We go live 3 nights a week and put out videos every day. Boris Johnson had promised an official announcement by this coming Monday on whether a full easing of restrictions would go ahead on the 21st of June. However, Harry Cole from The Sun reports the decision has in fact already been made. So he tweeted this afternoon, new final decision Monday, but Sun can reveal chances of Freedom Day on June the 21st now next to zero. Plan to announce delayed to June 19th with break clause on July the 5th if hospitalizations remain low, but it's not looking good. So saying there's going to be a 4-week extension to the current situation we are in. So that's no clubs, no festivals, but you can eat inside in small groups. So that's all going to remain the same for an extra 4 weeks, unless it seems that these rising cases are not leading to further hospitalizations. Now, this news all comes as The Guardian reports that cases are rising at their fastest rates since the winter wave. So the data behind that headline, daily infections are now rising at 3 to 6% across England. So that's every day. And official figures released today suggest the daily growth rate may be as high as 8% in the northwest and between 2 and 6% in London and the east of England. So that 8% in the northwest, that's really worrying. That's proper exponential growth. Now, this, of course, is all being driven by the Delta variant, which now makes up 91% of new cases across the UK and which is thought to be 60% more transmissible than the Kent variant and twice as likely to lead to hospitalizations. Now, the necessity of delaying any further loosening is made especially clear in this graphic from the BBC showing that at current rates of growth, we are on track to have 15,000 daily cases by June the 21st. So you can see that the dotted line shows the current trajectory we are on, the gradient of the line, the growth rate that we're currently at. And they're showing that, yes, by the 21st of June, it could be 15,000 cases a day and up to 40,000 cases a day a little bit later than that. This is how exponential growth works. This is a log scale graph, so as you can see, the cases are increasing exponentially even if the line is straight. Now, this is all very concerning. Of course, we aren't going to see, we should really emphasize this, we aren't going to see the number of hospitalizations and deaths as we saw in January. We're not going to enter into another lockdown similar to the one we had in January, and that's because most of the population of vulnerable age or people who are younger but are in vulnerable categories have been vaccinated. And we know that the vaccine is very effective, even against the Delta variant. Slightly less effective against the Delta variant than against the Kent variant, but it seems, I think they're saying 95% effective against hospitalizations if you've had 2 doses. So we're in a completely different situation to the one we were in January, but with cases rising at these rates, that's still lots of people catching COVID. Lots of them are going to get long COVID. And with numbers this high, you will get a significant degree of hospitalizations. And that will especially be among younger people, right? And so they'll say, well, that means it's less likely to convert into a death, because even if you go into ICU as a young person, you're much less likely to die and you'll spend fewer days there. But for me, it's incredibly worrying when anyone goes to ICU. I'm not particularly interested in how long they stay there. Just the fact you've gone to ICU with COVID, that's going to have really long lasting effects. Now, of course, if you think about that trajectory we're currently on, that's with the current restrictions, and what has dominated media discussion up to now is whether we should move from current restrictions to even less restrictions. Now, again, thinking about the trajectory we are on that graph on the BBC, you might ask the opposite question, which is, far from loosening restrictions, should we be increasing them? And again, I don't think we should be going back to anything like the lockdown we saw in January and February and March, but I think it is very reasonable for us to be considering what extra precautions we should be taking, because we want to get off that trajectory. And yes, vaccinating people is going to be very, very helpful. I got vaccinated yesterday. I'm absolutely delighted about it, but that's not going to kick in properly for 2 or 3 weeks. It's going to be ages until I'm double vaccinated. And as we can see, exponential growth happens quite quickly. So the vaccines aren't going to be able to keep up with this on the current trajectory we are on. This means that once again, focus from epidemiologists is on schools. Now, this is a topic that politicians don't like to talk about very much because it's awkward. It's a difficult one. But it does seem to me that this is an area which has been neglected and which we are all collectively paying a price for again. I want to go to a piece published in the British Medical Journal today, and by Deepti Bastani and Stephen Reicher and others, which warns that we need to refocus attention on reducing outbreaks in educational settings. Now, the authors complain, and this has happened actually throughout the pandemic, and it's really, really problematic, that Public Health England have been really, really cagey when it comes to details on schools. They're really, really resistant to publishing age breakdowns and publishing how many people are catching COVID-19 in schools, essentially because they're like, oh, we don't want to give the teaching unions a reason to complain, which essentially means they're duping lots of people. Very, very worrying in terms of transparency in government. Also leads to situations like this when we're having lots of outbreaks in schools, and that's threatening lots of people's health, right? I was going to say that I was going to end the sentence actually there by saying it threatens to delay the time when we can all go to nightclubs, because that's how it's presented in the media. But of course, that's not the most important thing here. The most important thing is that you're going to get students, parents, and teachers getting COVID-19. Sometimes that's going to translate into very serious illness. More often, it's going to translate into long COVID and things which are, again, pretty worrying. Now, let's go to the proposals which the authors of this article in the British Medical Journal suggest. And their proposals are as follows. This is the precautions we should be taking in schools. They say, first, we must reintroduce masks both at primary and secondary levels and both in classrooms and communal areas. Unions have jointly called for an immediate reintroduction of masks in secondary schools, and several local authorities have already reinstated these. This needs to be incorporated into Department for Education guidance as a recommendation for all schools. They go on. Second, there needs to be central investment in ventilation air cleaning in schools, including CO2 monitors and air filtration devices to supplement ventilation where needed. Risk can also be reduced by moving to learning outdoors where possible, including physical education activities. Third, there must be practical financial and remote learning support for families with children who are isolating. And lastly, the government must provide adequate catch-up resources for children who have lost out on education over the past year to bridge gaps and worsening inequities in education. They conclude by saying, in sum, schools are the place where infections are rising fastest, yet schools are a place where the basic mitigations of face, space, and fresh air are not simply missing, but in the case of masks, have actually just been removed. This makes no sense. The government must act urgently to protect and support its children at this critical juncture. Aaron, I want to go to you for your thoughts on these two big developments. So first of all, the government suggesting, or at least the Sun reporting, that the government are going to announce on Monday that there is going to be a 4-week delay to the removal of restrictions. And second, this, I suppose, alarm bells which are being rung by epidemiologists and other scientists saying, look, far from thinking about reducing further restrictions, we should be looking at precautions in the here and now, especially in schools.
It's a tough one, Michael. I mean, I don't know where you stand on it personally, but for me, I mean, what use is there really in children going into schools as a learning environment if they're going to have to wear masks in midsummer for 6 hours of teaching? Maybe it's smarter to do more homeschooling to end the term early. I mean, I don't know. As an intervention, it seems quite. I mean, they're going to be in those rooms 5 days a week for 6-7 hours at a time. What difference is a mask really going to make?
I think the epidemiologists say it makes quite a significant difference.
No.
Actually, I mean, it does in terms of, well, I mean, especially now it's the summer, so the window should be open. I think if you've got 30 kids without masks, they're talking quite a lot. That's what happens in schools, and you've got loads and loads of aerosols being released into that environment.
I'm not saying.
We also know that catching COVID isn't just about, oh, if they're all in the room, they're going to get it anyway. No, because it's about viral load, right? If you've got a mask on, the viral load is going to be much lower than if you haven't got a mask on. So, I mean, I think this seems very sensible to me to say, continue going to school, but wear a mask.
No, Michael, I'm not suggesting that given the size of the misgivings that, they just shouldn't wear masks anyway. I'm saying if that you're telling, let's say you've got a primary school of 1,000 children, have general assemblies, they have all sorts of classes, let's say 25 minimum, 35 generally is the sort of more likely number. What are the numbers actually? What impact would wearing masks really have? I mean, that to me seems unclear. If this is now hitting exponential growth again, wouldn't it make more sense just to close schools early? I mean, and that just seems like, you've got a real breach in this kind of dam and you're putting like a plaster over it. Yeah, because in time limited spaces, if you're going into a shop and it's, operating at maybe 30% capacity, yeah, wearing masks is really effective. But if you're putting kids into schools from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., 1,000 people in an enclosed environment, walking past one another, being picked up at the school gates, et cetera, are masks going to make a really major difference in terms of logarithmic growth? I suspect it probably won't. So, I mean, that's just my 2 cents.
I think neither of us have in front of us precisely how much masks will lower the risk of catching COVID in school, but I'm fairly confident it's significant. I would also say in terms of, I see the argument you're making, which is say, if this is going on, why not just close them all? I mean, a response to that, and I think that's why that hasn't been suggested in this article from the British Medical Journal, is that there are actually many intermediary steps we can take before then. And schools have been closed for such a long time that we really are prioritizing kids being in school. And especially as we're not going to see the same number of really vulnerable people catch COVID, we should be taking the more moderate measures. And given it's summer, I would imagine that you open all the windows, you pay proper attention to ventilation. Not all schools can open their windows, by the way. So this is where one of the real issues is. The schools haven't been provided with the simple things that one would need to keep themselves safe. But imagine you're a school where you can open the windows. Yes, I know, I think this should be all schools, but it's not. Then if you've all got masks on, I can see how you can make the judgment that we can keep this school open and still keep the R number down. I assume that's the logic here.
Also, if you're a child and you're 10, 11, 12, I mean, how effective is the learning environment if you're having to wear a mask in midsummer 6-7 hours a day? Like I say, maybe homeschooling in that case, both in terms of learning and in terms of public safety and public health, is a better option. It just seems a strange, we're so close to getting these kids immunized anyway and vaccinated. We're 2-3 months away from some of these kids getting vaccinated, hopefully, the vulnerable ones especially. It kind of seems a bit, I don't know. Just my two bobs worth. I'm not. Just to be clear though, I'm not suggesting that. Oh no, open the schools. They don't need to wear the masks. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. You're
saying just go the whole hog and close them if you're going to have to introduce these restrictions anyway.
Potentially, right? I mean, it does feel like by September we're going to be in a much better situation in terms of keeping these kids safe. And of course, look, we've come this far, and I know it's very stressful for families and for parents. And one of the big arguments about reopening, and it's something I've touched on when I've spoken to people about this, is because I've said, and we've spoken about this ourselves, Michael, it feels like things are normal for me, actually. And I don't understand what the sort of big deal is about opening up further after June 21st. But people with 2-3 kids have said, look, in the summer holidays, it's incredibly difficult to do things with kids under these conditions. It would be a godsend. So I do get that. But look, we could be talking about long COVID. If this carries on, potentially affecting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids, I'm not suggesting another lockdown like we saw last winter. I agree with you entirely on that. But I just think looking at the potential downsides, what are masks really going to do?
Well, they might do quite a lot. I mean, as I say, neither of us are in a position to say exactly how much they do. But they might do quite a lot.
They might. Well, okay. We'll agree to disagree. I mean, I feel like if we're looking at this kind of growth right now, I don't see what masks are going to do, personally. But that's another question entirely. If we were in a situation where we hadn't imported the Indian variant and case rates weren't going up like they are, yeah, that's a decent argument. But it feels like we're on a different trajectory now. But I mean, I don't want to be there, Well, I'm sounding like a COVID skeptic, or I'm the complete opposite, just to be clear.
Well, that's actually, I mean, I'm glad you raised that point, actually, because it is important to remember that the reason we are now in this difficult situation, obviously, even having reclosing schools as a question means that something has gone seriously wrong, considering we were in such a good place. There was a period where we were doing a show where there was barely any COVID in the country. We're talking about, is the epidemic in Britain over? People thought the epidemic in Britain was over at that point. And if we hadn't imported the Delta variant, it would have stayed over. We would have been, fine, right? This wouldn't have been a question. We would have been reopening nightclubs and festivals and football stadiums on the 21st of June. As I said, that's not my biggest priority anyway, but I mean, there'll be lots of people for whom it is. And the reason that's not happening is because Boris Johnson wanted a trade deal with India, and so left the borders completely open, and we imported a lot of a highly transmissible variant, right? And people say, oh, you're making it seem like this problem comes from abroad. No, I mean, we also exported the Kent variant everywhere, which caused huge, ginormous problems. The whole point with COVID-19 is the less travel for everyone, the better. Because once these variants get out, you can't put them back in. And it's just, it's the nature of how this works, that the variant which is going to take off is the most transmissible one. That's why the Kent variant spread all over the world when it was 60% more transmissible than the original COVID-19. And that's why the Delta variant has now spread everywhere when it's 60% more transmissible than the Kent variant. And that's why we're in this situation, because just being 60% more transmissible, given it can lead to exponential growth, puts us in a super, super difficult situation. We'll, of course, have more details about this on Monday when the announcement is made. I'm going to go to a comment. Joshua Youngerman with a $4 donation. Michael, what powers have you gained with Moderna? I've gained a slightly achy arm. I think that was it. A slightly achy arm, and I keep singing 9 to 5 whenever I wake up in the morning, because this is the Dolly Parton vaccine. She invested, apparently. Let's go straight to our next story. And the background to this is that we've been talking about, the difficult situation that the Delta variant has put Britain in, even though we have vaccinated so many people. Now, you've got to think that there are so many countries in the world which are at risk now of having this Delta variant that even we're struggling with. When we've got 60% of the population vaccinated, they've got 2% of the population vaccinated. So vaccinating the world, very, very important. It's our next topic. The G7 is expected to pledge to donate 1 billion COVID vaccines to poorer nations over a period of 12 months. Now, it would follow the UK's pledge of 100 million vaccines by next year, and the US's pledge of 500 million vaccines over the same period. So that's the commitments of those two countries, and we're expecting the extra 400 million to be pledged at the G7. Now, speaking from Cornwall, Joe Biden said this pledge would help lead the world out of the global pandemic.
This is a monumental commitment by the American people. As I said, we're a nation full of people who step up at times of need to help our fellow human beings, both at home and abroad. We're not perfect, but we step up. Well, we're not alone in this endeavor. That's the point I want to make. We're going to help lead the world out of this pandemic, working alongside our global partners. Under the UK chairmanship of the G7, democracies of the world are poised to deliver as well. This U.S. contribution is the foundation for additional coordinated efforts to help vaccinate the world. The British government, the Prime Minister, has led a strong campaign to get people vaccinated across the UK. I'm grateful they're making their own generous donation.
Now, this all, of course, sounds good. Donating 1 billion vaccines is better than donating no vaccines. But is it enough to lead the world out of the pandemic? The answer, according to nearly all of the NGOs and all the health experts, is not really. Now, there are two big problems. The first is the quantity pledged, and the second is how soon they will be pledged. Let's focus on the quantity first. So, as I've said, in total, the G7 are set to pledge 1 billion vaccines to poorer nations. Remember, though, these are vaccines which require 2 doses. So that's 500 million people. So they're pledging essentially to vaccinate 500 million people. Now, as you probably know, there are 7.7 billion people in the world. Now, the maths aren't particularly complicated here. We're pledging to vaccinate 500 million people. There are 7.7 billion people in the world. In response to Biden's commitment, Professor Peter Hotez, who is Dean of America's National School of Tropical Medicine and an expert on vaccines, said, "My take, 1.1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, 650 million people in Latin America, 0.5 billion in smaller, lower and middle income countries in Southeast Asia. That's 2 to 3 billion people, 5 to 6 billion vaccine doses. We desperately need a US foreign policy and American leadership to take on this challenge." So he's looking at the numbers of people in developing countries where they're going to struggle to produce the vaccines themselves. And he's saying this falls dramatically short. The WHO, for their part, estimate 11 billion doses are needed to vaccinate the whole world to a level of 70%, which would significantly reduce transmission and make the disease manageable. So you can see what is being promised is simply not enough. The second problem, as I've said, concerns timing. So if you donate 1 billion vaccines in 12 months' time, that's very different to donating it tomorrow. As we know, lots and lots of people can die in a very short space of time from COVID-19. When it comes to timing, the US is committed to distributing 200 million doses by the end of this year, and then a further 300 million by June 2022. The UK, for their part, have said they will deliver 5 million doses by the end of September, with 25 million more by the end of the year. As you can see, this all makes it seem we haven't had the full announcement from all of the G7 countries, but it looks as if much fewer than half of the 1 billion doses are going to be delivered over the next 6 months. So it looks like it's going to be more weighted towards the end of that time period, and that's not going to prevent huge outbreaks like what we saw in India. We know that when the Delta variant hits a country that isn't widely vaccinated, it's like hell. You know, the hospitals collapse. It's like here in January, but the virus is 60% more transmissible, which means it's going to be, well, actually more than 60% worse, because that's how compound growth works. Disastrous. In terms of the ambition that is required, WHO Director General Tedros said that Dr. Tedros said that to vaccinate at least 10% of the population in every country by September, we need an additional 250 million vaccine doses. And he said 100 million of those doses will be needed in June and July. So we're nowhere near any of that. Now, some of the most stinging criticisms of the G7 plans came from one of Boris Johnson's predecessors, Gordon Brown. He told Reuters, "I am afraid they have failed the first test even before they've had a weekend of talks, because it looks more like passing the begging bowl round than a comprehensive plan to vaccinate the world. And if the richest countries can't get together to mount a successful plan to vaccinate the world, I don't know who will." He also said, "The government has yet to recognize that if you're leading the G7 and you're talking about global Britain and you made a promise last Sunday that you're going to vaccinate the world, you've got to deliver on it. It's a catastrophic failure if we can't go away in the next week or two with a plan that actually rids the world of COVID. Now we've got a vaccine." And Boris Johnson was asked earlier this morning by Laura Kuenssberg why the ambitions weren't up to the challenge, why the numbers weren't big enough when it comes to what NGOs, what the World Health Organization is saying. He said, "Oh, look, we've created loads of the Oxford AstraZeneca jab. That's being put in loads of people's arms. I don't know why people are complaining about the UK." When you're talking about a pandemic on this scale, to say, look, we've done our bit, what more can you expect, is just, it's obviously absolutely immoral. I mean, because you could have said this as the government in March. Look, we've already closed the pubs. Why would you expect us to? We've already done what is historically considered to be quite a lot right? We've introduced furlough. We've closed the pubs. Why are you now expecting us to put together a test and trace system? Why are you now expecting us to close the schools, right? And the reason we were expecting them to do those things is because this was an extraordinary moment. When we say build a test and trace system, when we say pay people money to self-isolate, we're not saying, oh, you haven't done anything. You've done fucking loads, but you done fucking loads because we're in a global emergency which requires extraordinary measures. So to say, oh, well, why are you complaining at ours? Because we've already helped develop a vaccine and we've already donated 500 million quid or whatever. The answer to that is because these are exceptional times. We clearly need billions and billions and billions. I think the estimate is 50 billion invested in this to make it happen in the time frame which is required. And we are the country. They say, oh, look, we've already spent so much money on things domestically. Yes, we're one of the few countries in the world which is able to borrow on the financial markets for essentially 0%. These countries with 2% people vaccinated, they can't borrow on the financial market. So the idea that, oh, it's time for us to look out for our own is just the opposite of what we should be saying right now. When it comes to other leaders of the G7, two of them at least can say that even if they have not pledged enough vaccines, they have done one useful thing, which is to suggest they will support removing the patent on vaccines. So the two leaders who have are Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden. Oxfam today were protesting outside the G7, calling for the other 5 leaders to join them. I think we can probably see now a protest of them on the beach. You've got Macron and Joe Biden on one side, Boris Johnson, Merkel, and all the other leaders on the other. We are, of course, yet to get much concrete news from inside the G7. They started talking for the first time this afternoon. As was perhaps predictable, though, even if we haven't had any concrete pledges, we have had at least one gibberish intervention from the host. Let's take a look.
I think that is what the people of our countries now want us to focus on. They want us to be sure that we're beating the pandemic together and discussing how we'll never have a repeat of what we've seen, but also that we're building back better together. And building back greener, and building back fairer, and building back more equal, and how shall I, in a more gender neutral and perhaps a more feminine way. How about that, apart from anything else? So those are some of the objectives that we have before us at Carbis Bay.
Completely bizarre intervention. He's saying we're going to have a gender neutral building back better, but I mean, I suppose his job is to entertain. Aaron, what I really want to know from you is not about the gibberish Boris Johnson speaks, but about the insufficient pledges which have been made when it comes to vaccinating the world.
I mean, it doesn't touch the surface, does it, Michael? We've got, like you say, 500 million people could potentially be helped by this offer. I think last week the WHO gave sign-off to, was it the Sinopharm vaccine, one of the Chinese vaccines, and the plan is just for this one Chinese vaccine to produce, I think, 3 billion doses over the next 12 months. Now, clearly, most of that's for sale or it's for the domestic Chinese market, but those are the kinds of numbers involved from a middle-income country. I know China's the world's second largest economy, but it's not a hugely wealthy country when you look at it per person. And it does feel like global leadership on this has been taken with, people call it vaccine diplomacy, because we're meant to talk about, oh, the global bad guys, Russia, China, evil Russia and China, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Well, the reality is, in 12 months' time, it's perfectly possible that those two countries have produced far more vaccine than the G7 has, and given it to countries in the global south. I mean, that seems quite plausible right now. Could change, and of course, it's a baseline. It could be higher, but as a commitment. And look, Michael, our viewers don't need to be reminded of this after 18 months of this crisis, but it's in the rational self-interest of the G7 countries to vaccinate as many people as humanly possible. It's of secondary importance to vaccinating their domestic population because of the possibility of various, strains being generated and creating new public health crises at home. So it makes no sense from a rational interest point of view, or from a trying to, present or project a picture of American or Western leadership on the global stage. It doesn't make any sense at all. And I think there's two reasons why. The first is that the the electorates of these countries have been so massively shaped by miserabilist, misanthropic politics for about 40 years, really since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, that the idea that Joe Biden would say, well, we're going to produce, these are the terms that he needs to be talking in, we need to produce, 20 billion doses. Well, people say, hey, hold on a second, we need to put America first. And actually, if you look at Pew Research data over the last couple of decades, particularly in the last couple of years, I think it was actually in 2020, it's much more pronounced amongst Republicans, but even amongst Democrats, there's not a huge desire to actually help the rest of the world anymore. And you could say, well, there's some sort of positive manifestations of that, with not wanting to start new wars, at least openly, like in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's also not really much of an impetus to help the global south through multilateral efforts with vaccinations. So I think that's part of it, is the sort of domestic electorate. We see that with the Tories. They're cutting, foreign investment, foreign aid rather, I think from 0.7% to 0.5%. I think that's right. And it's hugely popular with Tory voters. So I think that's one part of it. And another part is, really there's just no strategic leadership coming from the West right now. And the fact that Joe Biden is this transformational US president, we were joking a year ago, he couldn't recognize his sister from his wife. It's a very, very strange moment, Michael, because we have these rising powers, particularly China, but also just in East Asia, the ASEAN economies are huge. And we're moving towards this world of multipolarity. And still the West isn't really recognizing the scale of the challenge and saying we're going to produce 1 billion doses. Wow, this is so underwhelming. You really aren't even meeting the sort of minimum expectations. And like I said before, we talk about rational self-interest.
No, absolutely. And the rational self-interest being that the longer it takes for us to vaccinate the world, the more of these variants we're going to have, and some of them might be somewhat resistant to vaccines. In terms of who's going to produce more, the Chinese or the West, I think that's very much still up in the air. I think what is for certain, and you say 1 billion for Sinopharm, I think AstraZeneca's looking at 3 billion. There's lots of companies planning to produce lots of vaccines. I think more what the Chinese example shows is that one, vaccine diplomacy has actually applied some pressure on the West. I don't think they'd be talking about removing patents at all if it weren't for the fact that there are alternatives in China and Russia. If you look at when there was a unipolar moment when the HIV crisis was going on, it took like a decade for them to suggest making HIV drugs affordable. The other big lesson from it is what you really want is a homegrown manufacturing industry for vaccines, right? That's what China has. That's why they don't have to rely on this begging bowl from the G7, who are never going to stand up to the plate in inadequate time. Aaron, I'm going to go to you super quickly because we also have a story on the special relationship coming up.
Yeah, it's important to say this, Michael. The Cold War was good. The Cold War was an amazing moment in human history because you had these two technologically advanced societies in competition for soft power. What does that mean? It means the space race. It means getting rid of smallpox. It means an unprecedented amount of leverage given to labor movements in places like the United States and Western Europe because there's this political alternative elsewhere. And like you say, once that disappears, actually, we see a real backtracking on sort of basic commitment to human rights and dignity and a bare minimum in terms of a global human standard. That's beginning to come back, it seems, with the rise of China. And I think personally, that's a good thing. I think that's a wonderful thing, both for the Chinese people. It means that 850 million people have been taken out of poverty since 1990. Sorry, but that's an unadulterated good thing in and of itself. And then secondly, yes, it puts pressure on the wealthier countries of Europe and North America to get their arse in gear and maybe one day, God, maybe do something about places like, sub-Saharan Africa and clean drinking water. The fact that 6 million kids die of preventable illnesses every year. I think once you have a unipolar world, people stop talking about that. We're moving away from it, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, liberals often talk about that, the unipolar moment as the one where there was finally some hope that we were all going to have a liberal future. It was terrible. The unipolar moment was really fucking bad. You are watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. If you are a supporter of our channel, of our organization, thank you so much. You make this all possible. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support. And as you know, we ask for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. We really, really do appreciate it. In a recent profile in The Atlantic, it was revealed that Boris Johnson disliked the term special relationship to describe the US and the UK. Now, apparently the Prime Minister considered it to be needy and weak. However, speaking to BBC on the day Johnson first met President Joe Biden, he backtracked somewhat.
I don't mind the phrase special relationship, but because it is special, and there's but it's it encompasses a reality, which is that the UK and the US have a real congruence of views on some stuff that really matters to the world, and so we believe very strongly in democracy. We believe in human rights. We believe in the rules-based international order. We believe in the transatlantic alliance. Joe Biden believes in that absolutely passionately, and we want to uphold that. We think it's been the guarantor of peace and security for a long time.
So how would you describe
we
any
also
affinity
we also happen to share objectives on tackling climate change and loads of other things. It's a relationship. You call it the deep and meaningful relationship, whatever you want, the indestructible relationship. It's a relationship that has endured for a very long time and has been an important part of peace and prosperity, both in Europe and around the world.
So what the mainstream media are focused on is whether or not we call it special or indestructible or whatever word Boris Johnson was trying to choose there. What I want to focus on is the concrete claims made there. So Boris Johnson said the UK and the US have a special relationship because we have a congruence of views and values. We believe in democracy, human rights, and the rules-based international order, and they believe in action on climate change, and also suggests that together we've secured peace and prosperity for the world. Lots of big, meaty, concrete claims there. Aaron, is Boris Johnson correct?
Michael, you're going to be really surprised to hear, no, I think he's completely wrong. A few things. Firstly, America wasn't substantively a democracy until the Civil Rights Act of the mid-1960s. Arguably, Britain still isn't a democracy. Its head of state isn't elected. Its second chamber, the House of Lords, isn't elected. But let's talk about the nature of the relationship. Where does it come from? The term itself was generated by Winston Churchill. It becomes overt after the United States enters the Second World War, but it starts before then, because before 41 and Pearl Harbor and FDR and the US join in the war effort against the Axis powers, Churchill is quite clear that there's very little chance of winning this, particularly if we don't want to rely too much on the Russians. When I say we, I mean the British Empire. It wasn't just Britain, it was the British Empire. The Indians and the Indian subcontinent in the Second World War, biggest volunteer army in history, 2.5 million people. We didn't stand alone, the British Empire, but it needed the Americans to get involved. And that required a certain amount of ass kissing. And so what Churchill was really good at, and this is why it's so surprising Johnson is saying what he's saying, because of course Churchill is his hero. He was saying there's a special relationship, congruence of values, shared culture, shared language, shared interests. So let's have this special relationship. And that effectively was how it presented itself to the US to get FDR involved, because most Americans didn't want to get involved in the Second World War. They viewed it as a European war, waste of resources, didn't want to do it, didn't want to touch it. In fact, many Americans, you don't hear very often in the sort of American establishment, are actually quietly sympathetic to Nazis, and we don't need to go there. But even people who weren't, like progressives, didn't really want to get involved militarily. So this was fabricated by Churchill in the mid-40s or the early 40s. And after the Second World War, what it really means is that Britain is no longer this great world power. It loses the Indian subcontinent in 1948. So what we have to do is we have to basically hold ourselves to the coattails of America as this rising imperial power, and we can still pretend that we're a great power because we have a special relationship with the US, or vicariously remain a superpower by virtue of being so close to the US, which in 1945, indisputably the world's hyperpower. I think 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, world's only nuclear power. The idea that it's somehow comparable to Soviet Union, which has just lost like tens of millions of people, is so ridiculous. Again, it's a piece of post-war propaganda to say there were kind of these two equivalent superpowers. So that's where it comes from, about the end of British Empire, the end of British hegemony after 1945. What's our place in the world? Well, we're still best pals with the strongest kid in the classroom bully, the United States. It wasn't about shared interests in terms of democracy, in terms of civil liberties and rights. No, it was about a shared economic interest in terms of how can we ensure Britain's interests, despite the fact we're losing Malaya, bits of Africa, the Indian subcontinent, how can we prop those up for as long as possible, given the fact we are just ultimately a medium-sized country in the North Atlantic now, the UK. And so that was a strategic decision to align ourselves with the US. So we go into the Korean War. You know, we do a bunch of things that is basically kissing America's ass. We go all the way through to the Second Gulf War in 2003. Finally, America has a bunch of these special relationships, right? You can look at Israel and the Middle East. It's both a cultural one, but also a military one. It's a huge recipient of American foreign aid. Saudi Arabia is a really special relationship. Japan, in terms of pinning back China and East Asia, very special relationship. Australia in the Asia Pacific, very special relationship. Germany, it doesn't want it to be a sort of a leading power in Europe for quite understandable reasons. You know, so a special relationship there. So yeah, maybe Britain does have a special relationship with the US, but it's like one of 7 or 8. And I think the Brits like to talk about it far more than the Americans do, because ultimately it's filling this huge cultural, political vacuum of the fact we're no longer this leading power, which, you know, people forget 80 years ago, Britain was. The British Empire was leading economic and military power. We no longer are. And so we live in the shadow of the United States by talking about the special relationship.
Would have been interesting if that's how Laura Kuenssberg responded when Boris Johnson gave that answer. We could talk for ages about this particular issue, but I know that Fox wants us to get through this because we've got so many stories tonight. We're going to go to Matt Hancock's evidence to a select committee yesterday. On Thursday, Matt Hancock gave evidence to the Health and Science Joint Select Committee on the COVID-19 pandemic. The session was highly anticipated because it followed 2 weeks on from Dominic Cummings levelling extraordinary allegations at Hancock. That was at the same committee. Now, the Health Secretary was helped by this opening statement from Committee Chair Greg Clark.
Now, we took oral evidence from the Prime Minister's former advisor Dominic Cummings on the 26th of May. Mr. Cummings agreed at the hearing to provide written evidence to substantiate various verbal claims that were made at that hearing. Mr. Cummings was asked to provide this evidence to the committee by Friday, the 4th of June, in good time to inform our questions today to the Secretary of State. We have not received that evidence, nor any explanation as to why that has not been available. Now, as Jeremy Hunt and I both said in our last hearing, it's important that if serious allegations are made against an individual, they should be corroborated with evidence. And it must be counted as unproven without it.
Now, that opening statement essentially meant the session was a little bit less dramatic than many of us had been expecting, because it was basically giving Matt Hancock a bit of a get out, saying, yes, Dominic Cummings may have levelled all of these claims at you, but we're not going to push too hard on them because he didn't back them up. Fair enough. To my mind, though, there were still lots and lots of interesting statements made by Matt Hancock in his testimony. I mean, it was over 4 hours long, and much of it was not very convincing. So these comments on the government's failure to pay people to self-isolate was probably what was most telling.
The very specific thing we're trying to understand, because this is a lessons learned exercise, is why in that middle period of last year, we weren't successful in preventing the second and third lockdowns. And when Baroness Harding gave that evidence in February, we were in the middle of our 3rd lockdown. Now, just on that point of financial support, some people say that one of the reasons people didn't isolate is because we didn't just give a simple promise that if you isolate because you're asked to by test and trace, we will make up, as the state, any salary loss that you have. Would that have helped?
Well, the challenge that we had with that proposal is the extent to which it might be gamed, because after all, a contact gives test and trace their contacts. That is what contact tracing is made of. And so you wouldn't want a situation in which you, if you tested positive, you could then list your entire friendship network who all get a £500 payment.
And that was an extraordinary explanation from Matt Hancock. So he's saying there was this policy which maybe could have worked to limit the spread of COVID-19, but we couldn't adopt it because it could be abused, and some people could use their friendship networks to get money. Now, where was a policy area where people were able to use their friendship networks to get lots of money? Basically, every other aspect of policy when it came to COVID-19. So when it came to PPE, what we saw is people who were in friendship networks with the Conservatives were able to charge way above the odds for PPE, which often didn't work. Matt Hancock didn't say, oh, well, we won't be able to do this because some people in friendship networks might be able to abuse the system and get money. He said, no, I'm going to do that. And by the way, when you point out that people in my friendship networks abuse the system to get money, I'm going to say, yes, well, even if that risk was there, this was so important because this pandemic was deadly and we saved lives by doing it. For some reason, that logic doesn't apply when it comes to this hypothetical that some people might have claimed £500 by gaming the system. Obviously, the difference here is they wouldn't have been in the friendship network of Matt Hancock. They would have been, probably working class people in the country for whom £500 means a little bit more than it does to Matt Hancock and his friends. Now, you might say, look, I've misunderstood. He wasn't saying the problem was that people would unjustly claim money and it would be a waste of money and we'd be rewarding cheats. You could say, no, his worry was that what would happen is that people would get COVID-19 on purpose. And so the policy could backfire. Instead of reducing the transmission of COVID-19, these payments could actually increase it. Now, for this one, I'm not going to give my own argument. I'm going to go to a behavioral scientist on this and one of the advisors to SAGE. It's Stephen Reicher. He sits on the SPI-B group. So that's the body which gives behavioral advice or behavioral science advice to SAGE. Now, Reicher replied the following under the clip we've just shown you. So he says, it was Tory anti-welfarism which determined the decision, the old discredited notion that the problem is benefit cheats when a far greater problem is lack of benefits and of benefit take-up. It reflects an elitist mistrust of the masses, the same ideology which led the government to delay lockdown because of a supposed behavioural fatigue and to delay testing and masks on the ground that people wouldn't wear it. They were wrong on every count and we paid for it in lives and economic devastation. It shows that the failures of this government aren't coincidental, that it isn't a matter of a few incompetent individuals or bad uns or of narrow-minded groups. It is dialed deep into their ideology. It is expressed in so many intellect ways, and it comes down to the fact that they see the public as a problem when the evidence shows that collective solidarity is the best asset in a crisis. I think that last sentence is what's so important there. Stephen Reicher is someone who has studied how the public behave in pandemics, and he said actually what the government should do is draw on people's collective solidarity. That is the best way to contain diseases. It's not to assume that everyone is incredibly cynical and is going to try and game the system, even if that's what Matt Hancock's friends do. It's not what the general public are going to do. That's according to behavioral scientists who have studied pandemics in lots of different environments. But instead, we have a government who assumes the worst about the general public and assumes the best about their own friends, or at least accepts the worst from their own friends. And what we have is a situation where 40% of people who were contacted didn't self-isolate because of this, I suppose, this quack idea that if you introduced some kind of benefit to make life more livable for ordinary people, they would go out and lit lampposts to get COVID-19 on purpose. Aaron, we've been complaining for months that the government hasn't paid people to self-isolate. This is such an obvious gap in their pandemic response, and it's almost inexplicable why they haven't introduced it. What did you make of that explanation from Matt Hancock?
Well, it's quite a vanilla sort of neoliberal argument. We saw this repeatedly actually towards the beginning of this crisis, and this is where you saw cracks in the kind of neoliberal economic orthodoxy, because the very same people who said, well, austerity would be a really good idea in 2009-10, the exact same people, some of the exact same economists were saying, well, look, we can't pay people not to work because it doesn't create the right incentives. That'd be a terrible thing, actually, for the economy. And clearly that is the stupidest thing, AKA, by the way, we don't want to disincentivize work. No, that's absolutely what we want to do. We want to have a demobilization of the economy to get on top of a pandemic, right? The public health argument was, you want to definitely not have people having the incentives to work. Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. And it sort of, I think, puts into clear view how utterly stupid the arguments around austerity were. Crackpot arguments, Michael. And it's easy to look in the rearview mirror at 2007, 2008, 2010 and go, well, they were all so wrong. But we've basically lost, as a country, as a society, we've basically lost 13 years because today. I mean, we're still losing years, but in terms of life expectancy, in terms of child poverty, in terms of access to buying a home, you know, in terms of being above the sort of the poverty threshold, 60% of the average wage, we've basically lost 13 years. Debt's going up because of these idiots. And I think we should be grateful that actually people are beginning to realize it's not entirely all it's cracked up to be. And actually they shouldn't be listened to. And actually, yes, when you hear them and you say, well, that doesn't sound like common sense, you're entirely right. It isn't common sense. You shouldn't listen to them. A lot of them are idiots and ideologues and zealots and fanatics. And I think Hancock summed it up pretty well.
Very depressing and very well put. Let's go straight on to our next story. The stakes in the election to be the next General Secretary of Unite could not be higher. Now, Unite has 1.4 million members. As we rebuild from the COVID pandemic, there is a chance to pressure employers to change the way we work. The militancy of big unions will really matter. Do they have leaders who want to roll over when employers and the government demand certain things, or will they be willing to stand up and fight for a shorter working week, for the right to work from home when people want to, for better sick pay, for example? Who leads Unite matters for all of those things. It also matters for the Labour Party. Now, Unite is Labour's biggest donor and it controls key votes at the party conference and on the party's NEC. Now, what I think is probably going to be the priority for centrists in the Labour Party is to change the leadership rules to bring back the Electoral College so someone like Jeremy Corbyn can't be elected again. I think if a right-winger leads Unite, replaces Len McCluskey, a left-winger, then that will be, you know, almost a given. I think that will happen. So it really, really matters that the right don't win this. Unfortunately, it seems they could. And that's because the left vote is currently split between three candidates and the votes of the right will be united. Now we can get up the candidates now. The left candidates are Steve Turner and Howard Beckett, who are both currently Assistant General Secretaries to Len McCluskey. Also on the left is Sharon Graham, who leads the organising department. So those will all be competing if they all remain. If they all remain in the race, they will all be competing for votes from the left. And on the right is Gerard Coyne, who has no other competition from the right. Now, Coyne has stood in the past. He stood in 2017 against Len McCluskey, and he only narrowly lost. So in those elections, Len McCluskey got 45% of the vote and Gerard Coyne got 41% of the vote. Again, in those elections, the left vote was split. Ian Allinson was also appealing to left-wing voters. And I mean, if he'd got a couple of percent more, it could have been Gerard Coyne who'd won then. If Gerard Coyne had won in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn would not have lasted as leader of Labour for as long as he did. Now, the reason there are four candidates is that to qualify for the ballot, they all needed to secure nominations from at least 5% of Unite's branches and workplaces. In this instance, that meant candidates needed 172 nominations. As we can see here, all four made the grade. So Steve Turner got 525 nominations. Sharon Graham got 349. Howard Beckett, 328. Gerard Coyne, 196. Now, you might look at that thinking, why are we worried about Gerard Coyne? He's got so few nominations. Well, the issue is among organised workers in their, in their branches where they vote on this, Gerard Coyne is not particularly popular. But the fear is that now he's on the ballot, he'll have a very organised campaign. They'll be advertising on social media to less organised Unite members, and that could get them over the line. As you saw before, Gerard Coyne got 40% of the vote, and he definitely didn't get 40% of the nominations that time around. So he'd be expected to overperform this phase. Of course, all of this means that the left really need one candidate. They need a single candidate to be able to beat Gerard Coyne. In fact, speaking on the show back in February, that's what one of the candidates said. This is Howard Beckett speaking on the issue of multiple left candidates running against Gerard Coyne.
The right wing will not get on the ballot, Michael. You're hearing it from me first, because it is a high bar that they would have to meet, and our branches will not allow that to happen. But if for any reason I was wrong, you can do two things. First of all, knock me over with that feather that I've referenced. And secondly, put the lock in the door until the three candidates who describe themselves as the left reach an agreement as to who the candidate should be.
That was Howard Beckett on an episode of Tisky in February. He, reassured us that Coyne wouldn't get on the ballot. He did get on the ballot, and he's now said, and he said that if he does, lock us in a room, don't let any of us out until there's just one candidate standing. They have been meeting. So this idea of them all being in a room, that has happened, but it doesn't seem as yet as if any of them are willing to stand aside. We can go to some of the statements now. Let's start with Steve Turner. So he released a statement on Thursday saying, as you will be aware, at close of nominations yesterday, I had reached 526 nominations from branches across our union. This represents by far the largest number of nominations received by any candidate, and it continues to grow as the validation process is completed. Given the leading position I hold and the consequences of a split vote for our union, I had a responsibility to meet with other candidates to investigate the opportunities to secure a single nominee for the ballot. Those discussions have started and are ongoing, and I trust you understand that a running commentary would be unhelpful. He's clearly not planning to stand down. He did get the most nominations, somewhat understandable. Let's go to Howard Beckett's statement. I'm not going to read the whole thing because this was quite a lot longer. You can look at it on his Twitter if you want to see the whole thing. He said, at today's meeting, my campaign made the case as to why our candidacy far outstrips others and is best placed to win the election. We were the only team to present proposals at today's meeting with the aim of conducting a transparent and fair process in order to agree one left candidate, as I want to ensure that our programme for improving the working lives of our members remains paramount after the election. I have, as yet, not had a formal response to those proposals, and discussions will continue. Now, I presume one of the reasons he might not have got a formal response to those proposals is that Steve Turner will say, look, there already has been an open and fair process. It was the nominations process, and I won that. He also, by the way, won the caucus within the United Left. That's why lots of people are saying, look, Steve Turner's the obvious candidate here. Perhaps Howard Beckett's trying to, get some guarantees from him. I'm in no position to say. Potentially most worrying is Sharon Graham's statement, which suggests she has no interest whatsoever in standing down to allow for there to be a unity candidate. She posted on her Twitter this morning, thank you for all your messages of support. I have today submitted my acceptance of nominations and officially confirmed that I will be standing to be the first woman General Secretary of Unite. I look forward to working with you on our programme for positive change. I, of course, have reached out to other candidates to join my team and await their response. In the meantime, I am focusing on winning for workers. So she's invited people to join her team. Aaron, this could be an absolute disaster, couldn't it? There are now, of the three big unions, so GMB, Unison and Unite, two of them are controlled by people who are very supportive of Keir Starmer, who would not object to something like returning the Labour Party to an electoral college system where no left-winger can be elected again. If Unite also falls to the right, the left can say goodbye to the Labour Party. And it looks here as if we could have three left candidates splitting the vote in a first-past-the-post election. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, so a few things. Firstly, you're absolutely right. The stakes with the Unite General Secretary vote are super high. And people say, well, look, we should be talking just about the sort of the labour organising element of Unite. And of course we should. That's the point of a union. But it's also I think it's a bit silly to say that Unite and its political leadership over the last 10 years hasn't obviously been a major factor in a resurgence of the parliamentary left in this country, right? I think that's a pretty fair assessment. You shouldn't just vote for the General Secretary on that basis, but you can see why it's relevant for many, many people. In terms of what has to happen, I mean, I'm quite optimistic in terms of if there is a single left candidate, they would beat Gerard Coyne. You go back to the last time, Ian Allison, like you said, was very close. But if you put his and Len McCluskey's votes together, it's about 60-40. Which, it's not a landslide, but I think 60-40 for me is kind of like, that's the beginning of a big win. It's a 20-point difference. So, and on 12% turnout, and I don't think it would be lower than that. And I think many people didn't vote thinking that Len McCluskey was just going to win. I mean, he had more than like 1,000 nominations. So I think a single left candidate would do really well on a message of not just giving money to Labour willy-nilly, but actually getting political leverage in return, because that's what members want. Gerard Coyne's pitch is, I will give Labour resources and money without asking any questions or trying to have any impact over policy. Why the hell would you do that? He's basically going out there saying he's like the anti-Trump. I am the worst negotiator you could possibly imagine. I'm going to give you this money and I want nothing in return. That seems to be his pitch right now. So I don't think that's going to be very alluring to many people. between those three candidates, Sharon Graham, Howard Beckett, Steve Turner, cards on the table, I think it should be Steve Turner. I know as journalists, Michael, we shouldn't be saying that, but I think as a left, you look at the nominations, you look at the internal caucus process. I mean, I would need to hear strong countervailing arguments from the other two why it shouldn't be Steve Turner, and we've not heard those. I mean, that's possible, right? They might be able to say, I know, for instance, Howard Beckett's contested the validity of the process to internally adopt a candidate. Okay. So let's say it was a draw. He's still got the most nominations from, the wider membership of Unite. Sharon Graham saying, I want to be the first woman general secretary. Well, look, a woman leads the TUC, a woman leads the UCU. Unison has a woman general secretary. It's fantastic, and it'll be a wonderful thing for Unite. But I don't think that's sufficient to say it's not like the Labour leader, for instance, never had a woman leader. You say it's time, has to be a woman. No, I think we have to be pretty clear that somebody's won the most nominations from branches. They won the internal left caucus. I don't think that's sufficient to overwhelm that. My personal view. I mean, again, people who disagree. So for me, it should be Steve Turner. Initially, all we're seeing here could just be jockeying for position. My worry is, though, and if it was just two, you'd say, fine, you just need to get one person to agree. But it's three, which means two people are going to have to stand down. And that, I think, presents a real collective action problem. And so, on the one hand, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, even if one person ultimately agrees to that and can seize it standing down, you still have a major issue. And if Gerard Coyne does win, Michael, it's a huge defeat. It's a huge defeat for the left. Huge. Maybe Luke Akehurst is watching this and sniggering, and he'll post it to Twitter later on. It's huge. It would mean not just a backward step for the left, the parliamentary left, because again, that's not what trade unions are fundamentally about. But what we would see with Gerard Coyne as the General Secretary of Unite is basically like Margaret Hodge now on Twitter, just talking about Jeremy Corbyn, talking about the past, sabotaging, I think, actually the Labour Party in key ways. I think not intentionally, but I think just incessantly talking about the past, looking inwards, not providing a story and a project for the broader public to get involved in and get excited about. And I think the left has no chance if it doesn't do that, both with regards to Labour, but also the Labour movement. So really big stakes. And if Gerard Coyne wins, terrible, terrible day. Can't happen. We shouldn't say that as journalists, but it really would be terrible.
Before we go on to our next story, we want to hear from you, not just about the stories we've been talking about tonight, but about Novara Media in general. That's because we're currently conducting a survey of our audience to find out what you like about our content, what you don't like, and any ideas you have for Novara Media, for the organization. We're going to take those into account as we decide how we're going to grow. Now, if you want to go to novara.media/survey, you'll be taken through to it all. It should all be very self-explanatory, and that link is below in the description of this video. It takes just 5 minutes to fill in, and we really do appreciate it. Next story. Under the ownership of Rupert Murdoch, The Sun became Britain's best-selling newspaper. In the 1990s, its circulation peaked at 5 million per day. It's toxified this country's discourse about migrants and benefit claimants, and its support has always been seen, and for the last 40 years at least, as necessary for any party leader to become prime minister. However, Rupert Murdoch now thinks the brand is worthless. The FT report that Murdoch has written down the value of the paper to zero. The company's most recent accounts show that during the pandemic, News Group newspaper, which operates The Sun and The Sun on Sunday, nursed pre-tax losses of £210 million. Aaron, I want your thoughts on this. The Sun has shaped British politics for the worst for over 50 years. It was bought by Murdoch in 1969. I really didn't realize it was that long ago. How much does it matter that he now judges the paper to be worthless?
It's not worthless. It was never about making money. It was all about influencing political outcomes. The Sun hasn't been making money for a very long time. Not serious money anyway. Not enough money that you would invest in its long-term future, build new infrastructure, have really forward-looking recruitment programs and so on. Where its value lies, Michael, now for Rupert Murdoch, look, he's an old man. He's in his 80s. It's about ensuring political control over the right people for long enough, it might be around another 10, 15 years. And that's ultimately what the Sun is about. It doesn't need to make money. It's been losing money, for a pretty long time. So I don't think there's a future for the Sun as a commercially viable project, but I don't think that's why Murdoch bought it in the first place. He bought the News of the World, I think, in 1968, bought the Sun a year later. I mean, the story of the Sun and Rupert Murdoch is a remarkable one, Michael. When he bought it, he promised the trade unions behind its publication that it would remain a Labour voting newspaper. And like I said, that was in 60. You said it was in 1969. I think they endorsed Labour in 1970. 1974, they went Tory. And in 1979, there was a 1,600-word leader article in the Sun. It's like an LRB article, right? 1,600 words saying why people should vote Margaret Thatcher. 1,600 words. A year later, the first editor under Murdoch, a year later, Larry Lamb, guess what? He was given a knighthood by Margaret Thatcher. You don't understand the political revolution we had in this country with the Tories, with Thatcherism, then with Blairism fundamentally, not any big changes to the economic model of the country. You don't understand that without also looking at the history of the Sun newspaper. So yes, it's brilliant that it's not making money. I mean, it would be terrible if it was profitable as well as politically influential. But that's not the fundamental reason why Murdoch has it. And he has a bunch of other projects which are also hugely influential. It's only one part of the empire. However, there are parts of his sort of stable, Times Radio, the Sunday Times. You can see how they are viable and profitable media projects for the 21st century. The Sun isn't one of those. So partly to be celebrated, but that was always the game, right? He is not making money from his UK outlets. It's about shaping the Anglophone political sense of possibility. The big money he's always made has been in the States.
In terms of the money, though, I see what you're saying about this was never really about profit when it came to the Sun. It was about influence. But the reason it's not making a profit is tied to the fact it is losing influence now. If its circulation has dramatically fallen, and that's why he's not making a profit anymore, then presumably whatever is written in the Sun, whatever party the Sun endorses at the next general election is going to be less important than it was, a decade ago. Or do you think I'm mistaken there?
I don't think you're mistaken. Clearly, the Sun isn't deciding elections like they claimed to in 1992, right? It was the Sun what won it, and I mean, I'm not going to give them the kudos to say that was correct, but it was more plausible then than it is now. And of course, remember in 2017, the Daily Mail had, I think, the first 16 pages of the Daily Mail on the day of the 2017 general election was a hit job on Jeremy Corbyn. It didn't seem to have an impact. But I think you have to accept Rupert Murdoch as a variable, right? You've got HarperCollins, I think, as a publishing house. You've got Talk Radio. You've got the Sun. You've got the Times. You've got the Sunday Times. And he operates in fundamentally an alt-right media ecology in this country, which, by the way, is the mainstream media. It's not people talk about. It's what's our Fox News and Breitbart. No, in this country, that is LBC and the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express and the Telegraph. The alt-right is the mainstream media here. And I think, his outlets are a big part of that. And sadly, because, the BBC, because of cuts, but also I think because of politics, really does still take a lead in terms of its political agenda from the newspapers. And that alt-right, tabloid sphere, which to a significant extent is influenced by Murdoch's papers. So, yes, he's not as influential as he once was, but I still think people like Murdoch, the Barclay brothers, Viscount Rothermere, none of who pay tax here as UK nationals, and yet they think they should be allowed to shape the political debate in this country about the appropriate levels of tax and public spending and so on. Obviously, disgusting human beings. I think they really do still play a major role in the politics of this country and the sense of broader political possibility. I think it's changing. So, for instance, LBC, I think, is a real new kid on the block. I think for me, LBC is actually the closest thing we've got to Fox. People talk about, we're going to have, GB News. I think LBC's kind of already done it. You look at what Nick Ferrari says, the stuff they were doing with Corbyn, Farage on there. They make and when I say, what do I mean by saying it's like Fox News? There'll be a completely deranged story, and Fox or whatever, and the mechanism by which that becomes a mainstream story, gets into the BBC or wherever, is generally LBC. More often than not. So, we're seeing some changes, but Murdoch and his outlets are still incredibly powerful. not for people under 35, but you have to remember, of course, this is a country, its median age is 40, and the economic and political power, because of our electoral geography, but also because of, house values and so on, is overwhelmingly in the hands of older people, and they still take a lead, I think, from people like Rupert Murdoch, generally speaking.
I think that's a very fair assessment. It might be worthless, but the guy's still got quite a lot of power. Our final story for the evening. While the England football team have taken a brave stance against racism by taking a knee at the start of matches, Britain's political leaders had remained fairly silent. On Monday, Boris Johnson's spokesperson refused to condemn fans that booed players as they protested against racism. And Keir Starmer has said, as usual, nothing. That has now all changed. So 6 days after the initial incident, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said that Boris Johnson wants fans to cheer England's players on, not boo them. So he's saying, no, do not boo them. There's finally, it's not quite a condemnation, but at least he's taking a position. He was not going to do that, or he didn't do that earlier in the week. Now, a couple of hours after that story broke, The Guardian published an exclusive interview with Keir Starmer in which he accused the Prime Minister of failing to show leadership. This is Keir Starmer now saying the Prime Minister should have condemned the people who booed taking a knee. Now, Starmer told the paper, the idea you boo the team is completely wrong. This is the response to what is an important collective decision by the team about their expression of their opposition to discrimination and racism. That's a decision they've taken, and I think they're right. All of us should support them, and all of us in a position to do so should show leadership, as Gareth Southgate has done, and have the courage to call it out and say it's the wrong thing to do. The Prime Minister was wrong when he refused to call it out. He didn't have the guts to call it out. He hedged his bets, and in doing so, he undermined the team on the verge of this competition. He didn't have the courage to side with the players. That is leadership. Compare and contrast him and Gareth Southgate on this. He didn't have the courage to stand by the England team on the verge of this competition, and he's wrong about that, and that's a failure of leadership. Now, that's all very well. I agree with everything Keir Starmer has said there. The problem is it took him 6 days to say it. So if you're saying that Boris Johnson didn't show leadership because he didn't condemn the people booing the England players, neither did Keir Starmer, right? Until 6 days later. Now, why did it take this long? Now, it could have been that they were waiting for a focus group to deliver back their results, or it could have been that, like the rest of us, Keir Starmer's team were on Twitter on Thursday and saw that YouGov had actually done a poll on this, and that their silence was very much out of step with the general public. So YouGov did a poll among fans across all of Europe, because obviously countries all across Europe who were entering Euro 2020, and they found overwhelming support for people taking the knee basically everywhere, most strongly in Portugal, which I found somewhat surprising, but also very strong in England. So in England, 54% of people support players taking the knee. Only 39% of people oppose it. That rockets to 78% of people when only asking ethnic minority Britons. Only 12% of ethnic minority Britons oppose taking the knee. Aaron, Starmer has finally come to the right position, but he sure has taken his time. Does he demonstrate the failure of leadership that he accuses Boris Johnson of?
100%. I mean, what he's saying about Gareth Southgate as embodying a certain kind of leadership, I entirely endorse. I think it's absolutely true. I think what Gareth Southgate's done is show real moral courage, which is incredibly, you see it so rarely in British public life that it's kind of like, oh, wow, he's doing something not to be popular. Because often people will make these statements. So I stand with the LGBT community, or, Black Lives Matter, and then they become really unpopular. And then they go, oh, God, yeah, you're right. Or solidarity with the Palestinian people under occupation. And they become unpopular. People criticize them. They might start losing jobs. They might start having, have people who they respect say, that's wrong, actually. I don't agree with you on that. And they don't have moral courage. And so they say, oh, what, you're right. It's complicated. They might even take back what they initially said. And what Gareth Southgate's done is actually double down, not a belligerent way. And he said, no, actually, I've thought about this. As a team, we've collectively decided this. This is what we're going to do. And that's leadership. And so Starmer's right to observe leadership and highlight the facts. But like you say, Michael, this is another classic example of Keir Starmer ambulance chasing a political cause. You know, people call him Captain Hindsight, I think for good reason. And I think this is an example of that. And it has that double problem for him because, like you say, the leadership qualities, the moral courage, and I would not use those two words with Keir Starmer, by the way, moral courage. Put them out of the window. They really highlight his own deficiencies because those are the exact things he doesn't embody. You know, you might not agree with Brexit, and I don't think Boris Johnson agreed with it at one point, but the whole point of that political project that took the Tories to a major majority a couple of years ago was there's this thing, we're going to do it, we think it's the right thing because that's what people voted for. You know, and that's a politics, again, that Labour and Keir Starmer put themselves in opposition to. Or any number of causes over the 18 months since he's been the leader, more than a year, you would never associate him with moral courage. So, yeah, I think this is doubly bad for him. I think at this point, though, Michael, I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but I think just Keir's kind of a bit of a joke, right? I mean, I was watching like Arsenal Fan TV on YouTube, and they're like taking the piss out of Keir Starmer. You know, that's really cut through. The guy's a bit of a joke. So Jeremy Corbyn was a joke. He was Jeremy Corbyn for many people was a joke because they found the sort of political aura around him ridiculous because he was attached to all these stories. But what I think people dislike about Keir Starmer is actually, strange enough, what he was pitching. It's just that his pitch has really not gone down very well. You know, I don't really believe in very much. And I'm going to be a technocrat and I'm going to be professional and wear a suit. And people go, oh, wow, you're just a technocrat. You just wear a suit. You don't really believe in anything. And it's kind of like, for me, that's what's really interesting with Starmer is that people dislike him, not because they've not seen enough of him, not because they don't interpret him properly or because he's been misrepresented in the media. They identify precisely what he's trying to sell. And that's what they don't like. And that's really interesting, I think.
That's interesting, actually, because I mean, what really struck out this week was that YouGov have shown that Keir Starmer now has ratings which are, you know, just as bad as Jeremy Corbyn was at this same stage in his leadership. And now you can say, oh, well, why are you critiquing someone for being just as unpopular as the guy you supported? Well, Jeremy Corbyn was subject to a really big smear campaign. Keir Starmer hasn't been. And what's interesting, you know, you might say, oh, well, we're being biased because we're saying maybe he has been subject to a smear campaign and we're not recognizing it. Even Keir Starmer's stands don't say the media have misrepresented him. You know, no one is out there claiming, oh, the reason people don't like Keir Starmer is because he's been misrepresented. He's clearly been correctly represented. The media have reported Keir Starmer as he is. I mean, it's because they don't find him threatening. Why would they bother to smear him? But they have reported him as he is.
Yeah.
The public don't like him, and he's panicking now because what can you do if they're seeing the real you and they don't like it?
That's exactly it. I mean, it's unique, Mark. We're looking here at a story in British public life which the media are accurately representing. It doesn't happen very often. It's happened with Keir Starmer. I mean, you know, I'll be honest, Michael, you know, and I think you and I were similar on this. We were open-minded about Keir Starmer, and I think the pitch that he had when he became leader, I'll be 80% of Corbyn's policies, but I'll be wearing a suit and lead into my credentials as a former director of public prosecutions. Actually, if you really mean that, I think that's a really great thing to aspire to as Labour leader. Obviously, he didn't. But I never thought he would be this, not even bad. I never thought the numbers would fall apart this quickly. You know, you look, for instance, amongst 18...
I definitely didn't.
18 to 24s, you've got, I think, Labour on 35. They're down like 20-something. You've got like the Greens second on like 24. I mean, people get this on Twitter today. And the Tories on 21. And people say, well, 18 to 24-year-olds don't vote. I mean, this is your base. Minorities, renters, graduates, the young, public sector workers. We saw a poll recently, actually, an astonishing number of nurses back Boris Johnson, not particularly fond of Keir Starmer. You know, Labour are really looking at a real hiding at the next general election. Like, it's frightening. And I think we're going to get a glimpse of Batley and Spen. And what's different with Batley and Spen, and I will bring this back to the Southgate thing, what's different with Batley and Spen to say Hartlepool is super explicable in terms of long-term trends. Batley and Spen is really different. You know, yes, it was a marginal. Yes, it has elements of people that want to leave the European Union and so on. It was a big far right there not long ago. I mean, obviously, the terrible events around Joe Cox demonstrate that. I think the BNP or the National Front, back in the day, big locally. But what they really show, I think, in Batley and Spen is the potential of Labour's vote to balkanise. And in Batley and Spen, you're seeing that with Labour and George Galloway, right? Potentially. So some Labour voters may be going over to the Tories, some may be going to other parties for whatever reason, and then you've got George Galloway, and that's going to happen, I think, in lots of places. Labour's problem now is losing voters both to your left and to your right, which is something that Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, almost miraculously, actually, he overcame, because it was the exact same challenge that was confronting a Miliband in 2015. So going back to the Gareth Southgate thing, it just reeks of desperation, like so many of these things. Just don't say anything here. You weren't on the story. Look, we're content creators at Novara Media, Michael. You don't talk about a story from 3 weeks ago on Tiski Sauer, do you? But people aren't interested anymore. If you wanted to show political leadership, if you wanted to influence the debate, Keir, you should have done it when you should have done it, which wasn't, on Friday. It was on Monday, or it was last week. And it was a real open goal as well, by the way. If you want to call yourself an England football supporter, don't boo the team. Not hard. It's really not that hard.
That's very well put, and a great note to end the show on. Aaron, it's been an absolute pleasure, as always, spending my Friday night talking to you about politics.
My pleasure, Michael.
One day we'll be back in the studio at the same time. Thank you as ever for watching Tiski Sauer. If you are a supporter, thank you so much. If not, please consider going to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Monday, same time, same place. For now, you've been watching Tiski Sauer on Novara Media. Good night.